Abolition of the family. Even the most radical flare up at this infamous proposal of the communists. On what foundation is the present family, the bourgeois family, based? On capital, on private gain. In its completely developed form, this family exists only among the bourgeois. But this state of things finds its complement in the practical absence of the family among the proletarians and public prostitution. The bourgeois family will vanish as a matter of course when its complement vanishes, and both will vanish with the vanishing of capital. So 180 years later, even broaching family abolition still makes radical communists bristle. After all, capitalism is destroying the family. It sets us to work and mediates our most intimate relationships via commodity production. Shouldn't we be against capitalism to save the family? And this is the line that the left tends to gravitate towards. The family is idealised as a haven of love and connection amongst a world of violent capitalist rationalism, and those who reject it are rejected as radlibs or worse, anarchists. Amongst it all, though, the long history of communists, including Marx and Engels, advocating for the abolition of the family is lost. But it's not just communists. In the mid-20th century, feminists agitated for liberation from the oppressive conditions of family life, but by the latter half of the century, these arguments were looked back on with a kind of embarrassed shrug, like, look, we're not like those crazy, bra-burning feminists who want to destroy the family. We're normal, sensible feminists. But we shouldn't idealise the family. We shouldn't try to remove the family from the historically specific conditions in which it exists and mutates, and then create an impression that this trans-historical thing called the family exists across everywhere, all through time in the same form. And we shouldn't assume its existence is necessarily good. So in this video, I'm going to largely place the family within the historical context of capitalist modernity. I'll describe its central function under capitalism as the locus of daily reproduction of workers, and show you how, far from destroying the family, the state and capitalism has worked to uphold the specific family ideal. This not only upholds systems of patriarchal dominance and gender divisions of labour, but acts as a border through which deserving and undeserving segments of the population are organised. Who's excluded from the family? Who's selectively included? Which form is the ideal against which everyone else is compared? So, it's Christmas time. Sit back, relax with your family, and listen to why I think we should kill your grandmother. Now, obviously, your granny sucks. I mean your granny specifically. She sucks. But she's not really the issue with the family. The family is a structure which is necessarily difficult to escape. It's made difficult to escape by its function within capitalism. Fundamentally, the family is capitalism's prime unit of social reproduction. It's the place where workers are reproduced both daily and generationally through mostly unwaged labour which is disproportionately performed by women. Cooking, cleaning, caring, child rearing are all needed to make sure that the labour force can get up tomorrow, and tomorrow, and tomorrow, and go to work. It acts as a social safety net in times of capitalist crisis. Channel favourite Silvia Federici showed in Caliban and the Witch how essential privatising social reproduction within the walls of the family was to the emergence of capitalism. This idealised unit of reproduction was also exported across the globe in various guises as a means of imperial colonial conquest. Both forcible inclusion of colonised people within it and the exclusion of particularly enslaved people from it was one of the methods of solidifying violent colonial regimes. And throughout the centuries, the family has operated as the cell of the social tissue within capitalism. It's been sort of a base unit upon which accumulation proper can happen. Like, you can't have proper capital accumulation without the family reproducing the workers. It's pretty essential to capitalism. Shit, even the Universal Declaration of Human Rights lists the family as the natural and fundamental group unit of society and is entitled to protections by society and the state. So there's a recognition that the family is an essential social unit, but the specific function of this social unit is obscured as an idealised site of love and human actualisation on the one hand, and a non-productive unit of economic consumption on the other. In Margaret Benston's now classic essay, The Political Economy of Women's Liberation, she challenged the dominant view held by both liberal economists and many Marxists that the family household unit was essentially just a unit of economic consumption. Instead, she argued that the family was an essential unit for the very production of the working class. That is, she cut to the core of why the family is understood as so essential that even the UDHR lists it as a fundamental unit of society, requiring protection. This production or reproduction of labour power is simply obscured by the devaluation of gendered labour. Benston illustrates this point by listing a paradox that if a man marries his housekeeper, he reduces the national income, since the money he gives her is no longer counted as wages. Understanding the family as an essential productive unit for capitalism helps us understand why, through direct disciplinary state action or through economic compulsion, leaving the family is a difficult feat, especially if you are disabled or in any way dependent on others to survive, or if you have dependents, if you have children. When social reproduction is privatised, the family is one of the most essential means by which people just survive. But more than just the bare facts of survival, the family also reproduces subjective ideological conditions of liberal capitalism. In the first instance, it naturalises this gender division of labour, and in doing so it reproduces the ideological and material position of women as subordinate natural caregivers. Beyond this, it reproduces liberal ideals and societal structures. The family, as a biogenetically centred mode of social belonging, naturalises social hierarchies and domesticates some of the conflicts they engender. Forms of gender essentialism anchored in the naturalisation of the household gender division of labour serve to legitimate a division not just of gestational labour, but of the whole of domestic labour, household work and management, caring labour, consumption work, and kin and community work. Class hierarchies and struggles can be muted through the compensatory status of the family as a haven in which naturalised difference of gender, class, sexuality, or age, for example, supposedly do not translate into inequalities, or at least not illegitimate inequalities.
According to a new Gallup poll, despite the fact that women are working more hours, pursuing careers, and taking care of the kids, women are still more likely than men to take on the dreaded domestic drudgery.
Margaret Thatcher,
I put a stake through her heart and garlic round her neck to make sure she never come back.
Isn't that a pretty horrible thing to say when her funeral's going on right now?
Too bad, too bad.
sharing some space with the UDHR, once famously said that there's no such thing as society. There are individual men and women, and there are families. And this can seem like a weird kind of paradox. How does liberalism maintain an ideal of individualism while the very existence of the individual rests upon care labour within a collective unit like the family? This is a paradox which is resolved by the invisibilisation of women and care labour from what liberalism considers the real world. Individualism is a condition of the economic man. He exists within the labour market, the public sphere, not the private. The family, as a unit of reproductive labour, is subordinate to the maintenance of the individual worker. This is, of course, also true of women when they enter the workforce. They are individualised within this context, and the fact that they are pressured into performing unwaged caring labour within the family is either minimised, dismissed, or a subject of direct discrimination. You know, women are still often told that they can't progress in careers because at some point they might have children. It's just a classic bit of discrimination that women get that men simply don't. The role of the family within capitalist networks of exploitation and ideology contributes to this double exploitation of women in society. This division of labour is therefore part of what I understand as an assemblage of class relations. So class isn't just a function of like the employee-employer relation, but is a whole load of other related divisions of labour, including gendered ones. For communists then, revolutionary politics isn't possible without actually attending to and seeking to overcome the gendered class oppression of the family. The most infamous communist proposal is obviously still necessary.
The International Party unite the human race.
But wait, someone might say, sure, my granny sucks. We all know my granny sucks, but I'm not pressured into caring for my children. I don't see it as a condition of exploitation, but as a duty born out of love. I think the role of love within the family is interesting. It's true that I do love my family, and you're not allowed to tell them that, or else they'll make fun of me. Keep it stum. And it's true that lots of people love their families. But even if care work is motivated by love, it doesn't mean it's not still labour. If you love your job, it's still work. And the role of love within families is undoubtedly one of the main ideological threads that allows this system of patriarchal exploitation to continue. While the material pressures of maintaining the family unit are very real and pressing, the ideological role that familial love plays in sewing together the seams of this productive unit can't be undersold. Love is ineffable. Its value can't be quantified. The acts of labour it inspires can therefore be devalued, and the labour power it produces can be cheapened. The nature of family altruism in some sense represents an internal exception to the free market, an imminent order of non-contractual obligations and inalienable services, without which the world of contract would cease to function. This premise is so constitutive of economic liberalism, both classical and neoliberal, that it is rarely articulated as such. But the emphasis on love as a familial ideal doesn't just obscure the fact that reproductive labour is just that, labour, but it also interacts with other conditions of the family which creates fertile ground for horrific systemic violence. The privacy of the family hides a whole world of violence. Like we know, for example, that most gendered violence, sexual assault, child abuse, and a lot of the abuse of disabled people occurs within the walls of the private family. And following Fanon's idea that violence is productive, domestic violence can be understood as just another means through which the gendered division of labour is upheld. The position of the home as a private sphere, rather than a public one, is obviously one of the longest standing feminist critiques. The personal is political, but families, especially those families which appear to adhere most clearly to societal standards like white middle class families, are the ones in which the private is most protected. And that is one of the most dangerous aspects of the family as an institution. It's not surprising that violence breaks out in the family, or that people are made victims of families, that children are devoured and smothered and hurt and battered in families. Women and children, and especially queer and trans children, are particularly vulnerable in families, where the abuse is hidden from view by the expectation that it is the place where they are most protected. The woefully undercounted yet nonetheless staggering statistics on domestic violence, including intimate partner violence, child abuse and elder abuse, attest to the dangers of the site. A recent UN Office on Drugs and Crime report, which found that the majority of female homicide victims worldwide were killed by their partners or family members, was released with the most telling headline that the home is the most dangerous place for women. Familial love serves as both a means by which this violence can occur and a means by which the very possibility of this violence is obscured from view. You know, I started out with this joke about your granny specifically sucking shit. And that joke only works because there's a presumed level of love that you hold for your granny, which extends to your whole family. Even if they do suck, which, to be clear, your granny specifically does, you are still expected to love them. And you might very well love your shit-sucking granny, but that doesn't change the fact that love as a social expectation within the family obscures it as a site of an epidemic of particularly gendered violence. So the family is the prime unit of gendered social reproduction, upon which the reproduction of labour power and the production of commodities can occur. It reproduces patriarchal domination, violence and death, and has been used as a method of colonial expansion since its inception. Moreover, the more cosy, loving elements of the family are not simply good aspects of a bad thing, but constitutive elements which allow the violence to go unchecked. Things aren't looking up for family heads. But what about alternative forms of the family? What if we extended the family beyond the bounds of its nuclear bourgeois white appearance? Wouldn't that be nice? So it's quite common to hear from queer circles that they left their shit-sucking granny and terrible family and instead have created a new found family. This is a family not bound by the horrendous queer phobia from which many people escape, and is also frequently a refuge from a world in which queer phobia is absolutely rampant. The found family in this case can appear not as a location of violence, but as an escape from it. Similarly, some black feminists have long critiqued a perceived white bias which emanates from family abolition feminists, and argue that rather than a location of the worst of patriarchal violence, the black household, which particularly was the case in the US, was a long struggled for unit, is a refuge against violence of white supremacy, and a site of political and cultural resistance to racism. Such violence included engaging in paid and unpaid through slavery, social reproductive work in white households for white families. And similarly, as violent border regimes rip migrant families apart, people are, I think, understandably trying to cling to the family, not abolish it.
Some 2,000 children have been separated from their parents and are currently held in dozens of shelters across the US. They were separated from their families after the Trump administration instituted a zero-tolerance policy to illegal border crossings.
These are serious critiques worth seriously engaging with, but I don't think they really put the argument of family abolition to rest. So, firstly, while it is true that the found queer family or the household can be a refuge from racism, homophobia and generalised violence of society, that doesn't really speak to the actual form of the family abolitionist critique. On one level, no good family abolitionist is arguing for maintaining the wider system of patriarchy, racism and capitalism. I mean, I'm drawing from the Marxist feminist perspective from this, and that views family abolition as a constitutive and necessary part of revolutionary action, as well as a kind of prefiguration of future communist societies. While non-dominant forms of family life are sites of resistance, that they have to be is itself part of the family abolitionist and wider communist critique. It highlights how ring-fenced, how privatised resistance to oppression has been forced to become. The public world is so hostile that resistance is often forced to be cooked up in the private kitchen. The private-public distinction is very clear, and that is one of the things that family abolition specifically seeks to obliterate. We shouldn't deny or denigrate important work that occurs within the family, within the household, but it is necessarily limited and something that we're seeking to move beyond. And on another level, recognising that the family is often a source of respite from the hostile world can perversely accentuate some of the forms of violence which occur within it. We're still often dependent on families to survive. This is doubly so for those who are subject to extreme forms of social violence. A queer family, made up of those who have escaped homophobia, may be even more difficult to leave if it becomes a site of violence precisely because now every option for the victim is terrible. They can't go back into the world, they can't go back to the previous family, but they're stuck in this horrible one. The problem that family abolition is tackling is the fact that families are private, walled, productive units under capitalism, which make them a site particularly at risk of violence. This is an argument which, of course, also extends to homonormative ideals of assimilating into dominant culture through marriage. That queer people may choose to form families is not a moral condemnation of queer people, but nor is it enough to overcome a homophobic world. the goals of family abolition are not satisfied by a flourishing of alternative family forms, not while the family remains a private unit of capitalist production. More than being inadequate, however, if we reify queer or black forms of the family as necessarily revolutionary alternatives, to use a phrase aimed at worker co-ops but applicable here too, I think if we view alternative families as an oasis within a capitalist desert, we actually risk upholding some of the things that make the family such an oppressive structure. To take a very clear example, gay marriage represents the selective inclusion of some forms of love and household within the legally protected status of the family, and thus necessarily rejects alternative forms. And to take another example, while some black feminists rightly point out that struggling to attain the family was a profound act of resistance, it's still true that with achieving family life, even as it was pressured and attacked by the white supremacist state, there is a sort of perverse reification of the categories produced by the family. By upholding a non-hegemonic form of the family as deserving of equal rights and respect as the white bourgeois ideal, that ideal is still legitimised, alongside a whole host of other white supremacist patriarchal ideas that it then implies, and the family as the prime unit of social reproduction remains embedded. None of the issues of liberal subjectification or of privatised social reproduction are touched. And I think a useful concept for sort of navigating and understanding this is one which has emerged from human rights literature, actually. The concept of cunning recognition. And this concept refers to a process whereby oppressed peoples are recognised as rights holders, but only when they adhere to a specific function in society. Within neoliberal rights discourses, this could be something like recognising indigenous rights, but only in the context of a still dominant settler state. For alternative family forms, cunning recognition is granted when those alternative family forms reproduce or legitimise or just don't even challenge the dominant family form, while leaving the family as a productive unit completely untouched. For example, the legalisation of gay marriage invited certain gay couples into the realm of legitimate family forms. But in the UK, this came alongside the criminalisation of certain, almost exclusively gay public sexual practices such as cottaging.
Take me to the places that I love best. And yes, I've been back.
Comrade George Michael, communist icon, criminalised for nothing. Notice how gay life is only legitimised as long as it upholds the walled private unit of the family.
Done with the kitchen table, baby.
As soon as alternative forms of gay love are expressed outside that wall, then they're criminalised. And the idealisation of the family has also functioned to legitimise the white supremacist nation, according to people like Paul Gilroy, and has been used to delegitimise and attack black people as such. This is a form of cunning recognition in action. The discourse of race as community, as family, has been born again in contemporary attempts to interpret the crisis of black politics and social life as a crisis of black masculinity alone. The family is not just the site of cultural reproduction, it is also identified as the mechanism for reproducing the cultural dysfunction that disables the race as a whole. The race is nothing more than the accumulation of families. The crisis of black masculinity can therefore be fixed. It is to be repaired by interning it in the family to compensate and rebuild the race by instituting appropriate forms of masculinity and male authority. You can see this play out very clearly in the US, where documents like the Moynihan Report from 1965, which argued that black poverty is the result of alternative, matriarchal, fatherless black families, which emasculates men and destroys the family.
Black America, the reality of being fatherless is perhaps most painful.
73% of all black babies are born out of wedlock.
Experts say there's a crisis when it comes to black fathers in this country.
This is still a popular thread in contemporary racism across the Western world, and is a good example of how the family ideal operates as a way to generate its own exclusions. Gilroy's argument also echoes the view that the white bourgeois family was exported across the globe as a tool of imperialism. And this doesn't mean that the white bourgeois family dynamics are replicated exactly as they are adopted or imposed upon colonial subjects. Rather, Kim Tallbear explains how settler forms of sexuality and family were imposed on indigenous communities in service of the settler state and its private property interests, at the same time as colonial notions of family insidiously continued to stigmatise us as they represent the normative standard against which we are measured. This is exactly what I mean by cunning recognition. But of course, recognition of some always implies that some are unrecognised. And this is where the destruction and separation of families at the border comes in. Migrant families are torn apart as a means of social control and precarity. I can't get fully into it here, but the border in capitalism is as valuable as a means of organising populations for exploitation. And you can see my Wisecrack video for a bit more on this.
So when neoliberal politicians pursue anti-immigration policy and rhetoric, it's not necessarily an irrational contradiction. Rather, it's an expression of an underlying goal: to separate populations, to protect the cultural superiority of market states, while selectively allowing the flow of racialized, low-cost labor.
But precarity makes populations easier to exploit. Destroying the family in the context of the dominance of privatised social reproduction necessarily places migrants in a more desperate condition, closer to death and easier to manage and exploit. In this sense, family destruction can be viewed of as a cunning unrecognition. But even when families are allowed unification, the racial state still utilises horrendous measures to maintain a kind of racial purity. Borders are used to maintain a hard racial hierarchy. In the UK in the 1970s, there was a growing concern of the number of single South Asian men crossing the border. And to stop these orientalised, overly sexual men from infecting the racial composition of Britain, the government started promoting a family unification migrant programme. But to police this, border guards began a programme of state sexual assault of migrating South Asian women through the guise of virginity testing. After this horrendous ordeal, women were allowed entry into the country to be a kind of containment for the otherwise aggressive sexuality of South Asian men. Family reunification in this context was dependent on sorting migrant populations into discrete, self-contained, but productive units of social reproduction. Self-contained, away from the white racial state. So it's here that you can see how family destruction and family reunification can act as two sides of the same coin of racial organisation. But what's essential here is that these moments of family destruction are not arguments against family abolition, but make a clear case for, firstly, abolishing borders, obviously, and secondly, for generalising social reproduction so that its withdrawal can't be used to dominate labour, particularly racialised and gendered labour. Nor can the risk of breaking the self-contained walled unit of the family be used as a spectre for racial domination. So, ultimately, your gay found family might be very lovely. Your granny, hypothetically, might not suck shit. Hypothetically. They might be an oasis of joy and security in a world of violence, but that doesn't undermine the case for family abolition. Rather, it's in making the case that family forms alternative to the dominant bourgeois ones are necessarily good that we risk reifying the very conditions that make the family a site of such oppression within this capitalist society. As J. Barnard notes regarding the tools of racial logic, power is never total. It relies on exceptions, the same way you can put holes in a steel beam to make it stronger. So, it's still common to hear or read defences of the family from the left which argue that the family is under attack from the forces of capitalism. This goes back centuries, as social reformers argued that appalling conditions of child and women's labour in factories were causing an immoral breakdown of the family unit. Maybe your granny sucks because of capitalist pressures. And in Engels' classic, The Origin of Family, Private Property and the State, he gives detailed account of the deprivation caused by industrial capitalism and its impacts on the family lives of the working classes. Since then, several Marxists, including those critical of normative functions of the family, have followed in Engels' footsteps by demonstrating the destructive force of capitalism on the family. But they've also drained the force of Engels' family abolitionist critique. Brace yourself. I'm going to use a Marxist word. Instead of understanding the family as a site of dialectical contradiction, which is both constantly under attack and reinforced as an essential unit of capitalist production, many Marxists have instead been happy to accept the liberal, bourgeois understanding of the family as it first appears to us. That is, that it's primarily a romantic unit of kinship. But once you start looking at the various ways capitalism and the state has upheld the family throughout the centuries, you just can't cling on to this simplistic idea that to save the family we have to end capitalism. Instead, to end capitalism, we have to end the family. We've pointed to some of the economic factors which established the family as a productive unit during the emergence of capitalism, but the establishment of the family was also used explicitly as a means to control and dominate colonised and racialised people. For example, colonial states imposed marital property relations upon indigenous peoples as a means of destroying their pre-colonial conceptions of land stewardship and then imposing colonial ideals of family household ownership. Similarly, the acceptance of previously enslaved people into the institution of marriage acted as another means of cunning recognition. The selective privileges of the family reinforced liberal capitalist ideals of the family as a patriarchal productive unit under capitalism and forcibly dismantled alternative bonds which were forged during and immediately after slavery. And again, you can see similar cunning recognition of queer life as the legal and monetary privileges of marriage are extended to certain queer households as they are selectively legitimised, yet those forms of queer life which are not included within marriage remain delegitimized and discouraged through exclusion in things so simple as marital tax breaks or through arresting gay communist icons.
Yes, I've been back.
Importantly though, acceptance within the family also comes with a policing of the failure to uphold normative ideals. Racialised and single mother family units in particular continue to face heavy-handed state discipline because of a perceived failure to uphold the normative liberal ideal of the family. You know, the vision of Britain's post-war welfare regime was explicitly to spread the ideal of the white nuclear family to the white working classes. Racialised families were always on the periphery. The theft by the state of black, indigenous and GRT children in particular is part of the capitalist state's commitment to upholding and promoting this white family ideal because they're understood to have broken that ideal, to have risked undermining it, so they have to take those children away. Particularly, though not exclusively, since the advent of neoliberalism, the state has created certain boogeyman figures like the welfare queen. These are understood as figures who fail to uphold the gendered privatisation of social reproduction within the family and instead rely on costed, state-provided means of reproduction. They fail to uphold the nuclear family ideal. The often racialised figure of the single mother on benefits hasn't only been used as a justification for horrendous state actions like child removals and disciplinary welfare, but has also been a symbol of ridicule and malice for decades.
They found a woman who holds the record. She used 80 names, 30 addresses, 15 telephone numbers to collect food stamps, Social Security, veterans benefits for 4 non-existent deceased veterans' husbands, as well as welfare. Her tax-free cash income alone has been running $150,000 a year.
And this has only been supercharged under neoliberalism. As Ruth Cain argues, neoliberalism pushes attempts to privatise familial responsibility in part through overt disciplinary measures, including behavioural legislation, such as parenting orders and welfare conditionality. And this has occurred alongside several heavy-handed state interventions to uphold the family. Melinda Cooper does an extremely thorough job of highlighting all the ways in which the US state has used disciplinary measures to maintain the family, including through direct police power. States were now required to increase their efforts to police, track down, and enforce paternity obligations on the presumption that the biological father of a child on welfare should be forced to pay child support to be deducted from state welfare payments, whether or not the mother wished to maintain a relationship with him. and in what must be understood as a blurring of the boundaries between the free and the unfree sexual contract, sanctions were to be imposed on mothers who did not sufficiently cooperate in helping welfare agencies to locate biological fathers of the children. This example is just one of the ways in which direct police power is used to uphold private family responsibility. The neoliberal state is not a force of family destruction necessarily, but one of family transformation and maintenance. And alongside this, the boogeyman of state debt is frequently invoked under neoliberalism to maintain the role of the family. Austerity cuts to community services, cuts and privatisations of childcare and care work, and disciplinary means testing of childcare benefits are ways in which the gender division of labour have long been maintained. Previously, state-funded programmes subsidised social reproduction, and they did so in ways that also upheld the family, but this has been transformed under neoliberalism in a way which can be hard to sort of grasp at first. That's why I'm sort of focusing on neoliberalism here, because a lot of people are like, oh, neoliberalism, that destroys the family. But no, it's just a transformation in how the state upholds the family. Under neoliberalism, these means of social reproduction, these previously public means of social reproduction, have been privatised, and the responsibility forced back onto the shoulders of women within the private household. And through these methods, capitalist patriarchy, as described by Federici, is reproduced. The value of labour power is systematically lowered as the cost of reproduction is moved from the state and disappeared into the ineffable world of love and familial care. And so while state debt is used to privatise social reproduction, household debt further traps women within the family, from which they often cannot escape. Household debts have spiralled under neoliberalism and are more commonly held by women. This debt can interact with childcare responsibilities and trap women within abusive households, or just, within households that they would rather not be in. I've heard so many stories of people breaking up and then having to stay living with each other because of debt and housing costs. It's truly obscene, but it shows that debt is a really effective way under neoliberalism of upholding the family household. It's a unit which is necessarily difficult to leave, even when the costs of remaining can be fatal. Housing reforms like Thatcher's right to buy scheme.
Don't you think she did any good?
Not a bit of good. Not a bit. I put a stake through her heart and garlic round her neck to make sure she never come back.
And the financialisation of housing have interacted with indebtedness and disciplinary welfare reforms to become a particularly sharp area of gendered violence. And as we said earlier, consistent with Fanon's description of violence as a productive force, this gendered violence is not just a reflection of patriarchy, but a method of reinforcing it and reinforcing gender divisions of labour, the very responsibility for which contributes to the risk of homelessness. So the commodification of housing and its impact on debt, rents and social housing has operated to maintain the family as a productive unit filled with danger and violence. Capitalism, never mind neoliberal capitalism, is not a force of family abolition, but the target of family abolitionist critique. While social reproduction is privatised within the family, capitalism will continue to function. While the family still operates as a private sphere, difficult to leave or escape, it will still be a site of gendered abuse and violence, and while certain bonds of love and kinship are upheld as ideals, then others will be attacked and snuffed out. Family abolition is necessarily a revolutionary communist project, and it is necessary to any revolutionary communism. So, by now you should be on board with the idea that the family, as it exists, has to be abolished. Because, why else would you still be here? Even if you have a nice gay family, or a granny that doesn't suck shit, and to be clear, only one of my grannies was bad, and I never met her. The other one was nice. But even if your family is nice, we still can't maintain this system of private social reproduction and violence. But what does abolition actually look like? And it's always difficult and to some degree impossible to fully envisage a post-revolutionary social organisation. Society has to emerge from the relations created by the revolution, not follow some idealised pre-revolutionary plan. That's what Marx and Engels meant when they cautioned against following a revolutionary cookbook. But as a wee conclusion here, so you don't all just leave saying, so what? We can still offer some indication of what family abolition might look like. Margaret Benston gestured towards some ideas in The Political Economy of Women's Liberation. She argued that private domestic labour should be transformed into a collaborative public industry under communism. Alright, it's John from the edit here. I'm struggling right now, but it struck me while I was doing the edit that while it's obvious to me that when I say social reproduction should be socialised and made public, that obviously that means that any gendered division of social reproductive labour has to be overcome. And that's the obvious implication from the previous 40 or so minutes of work. But I also realised that, sometimes I can't trust you lot. So I thought I'd better state it out loud that obviously family abolition and the socialisation and making public of reproductive labour means that any gendered division of that labour obviously has to be eliminated. All labour, all caring labour, reproductive labour has to be accessible and carried out by anyone and everyone. Just to clarify. Alright, back to the much more bright and happy version of me that's on video. Caring labour, like childcare, should be entirely communalised, no longer the private responsibility of a family unit, but a collective responsibility of every community. This doesn't have to look like an austere children's dormitory.
The hard knock life for us. It's the hard knock life for us.
Or state-enforced theft of children, nor should it just mean public schooling. Rather, children should be free to choose the conditions in which they live. Abuse, queerphobia and violence can no longer hide behind the walls of the family, and children should feel safe to leave adult figures who make them feel unsafe and access care in the community with no fear. In their work, Kinderkommunismus, Joanna Jules Gleason and Kate Griffiths offer a speculative view of how such socialisation of care might look like through an anti-dyadic creche. I don't have the time to detail it fully here, but Kinderkommunismus is only 20 pages long and well worth your time to read. Cooking and laundry could also be made functions of public life rather than primarily a private home. And I'm not saying that we ban home cooking, although for some of you that should be an option. I have seen your Instagram meal posts. It looks great.
They say if it's grey, it's healthy for you.
No one has ever said that.
But instead, communal decommodified food should be readily accessible to all, and all should hold a responsibility for taking part in food preparation. And obviously, all the legal privileges of specific living arrangements or forms of kinship must be completely excised. All of this, of course, comes alongside a drastic reduction in working hours and a decommodification of the entirety of social life. In short, communism. As Ruth Wilson Gilmore says of police abolition, abolition is not the absence of something, it's the presence of something. That's what abolition actually is. To practice abolition, we are required to change one thing, everything. That is, family abolition is a condition of constant mutual aid and care. Just as communism aims to make public the productive sphere, it must also make public the social, reproductive one. And while we haven't yet achieved communism, there are still small moments of experiment with family abolition. Idealist socialist communes of the followers of Robert Owen and Fourier attempted a limited project of family abolition. One that could only fail because they didn't have a revolutionary strategy. They were small units, oases of family abolition within a capitalist desert. But there have also been experiments from disabled groups trying to control their own social reproduction outside the bounds of the family or the oppressive capitalist institution. Judy Hunt details one experiment in the LeCourt Cheshire home whereby residents were able, for a time, to work collaboratively together and with staff to carve out their own lives in a system of outside of a system of systematic oppression. O'Brien provides several examples of embryonic family abolition within social movements. She begins her book, Family Abolition, with a discussion of insurgent social reproduction in Mexico, whereby revolutionary social movements opened up the opportunity for women to expand reproduction beyond the private sphere and into the public. And again, like the use of co-ops in the realm of production, these experiments demonstrate the capacity for reproductive labour to become public rather than private, to socialise the means of reproduction. But like co-ops, unless and until they are part of a revolutionary political project to overcome capitalism, they will remain as isolated oases within an encroaching capitalist desert. They can never truly escape capitalist social relations. Put simply, capitalism cannot survive without the family. Revolutionary communism cannot survive with it. And at the end of the day, now that you've got to the end of this, it's Christmas, you're sat there with the family. This is why I think we should kill your granny. Alright, thanks for watching. I promised that I would do the family abolition video, and it is here. It is the second last video of the year, but I managed to do it in the year, so go me. If you liked the video, please like and subscribe, and if you can, sign up to my Patreon, or you can offer a one-off donation via PayPal or Ko-fi. It's been a slow year in terms of this channel, but we're still plugging away. We're still hoping for for future channel growth. So shares are obviously very much appreciated. Patrons, $10 and up patrons get their names read out in the credits, which I will do in a second. $5 and up get access to a Discord server, and $2 and up get early access to videos and other writing. I'll have a bunch more writing to put on there soon enough, because I've got a bunch of papers that are going through review and have been accepted, and that'll all go up on Patreon as well, and some other writing and book reviews that I'll put up in the new year. So here are the $10 and up patrons. Demo Squid, Dying of Thirst, Soval Hayes, Earl Grey Tea, Bonnie, Katie Marshall, Joshua Moldenhauer, Nina G Public Relations, FD Signifier, Quint Wolf, King Crawley, Anita Anispe, Ellis Wren S, Hey Joe, Cameron Blakemore, Jacob Quinn Schenker, Menson Colbert, Alex, Tim, Daniel Swing, Unoriginal Name, Rachel Ann, Melanie Estes, Leum, Xander Corvus, Fia Westfall, Jack, TB Skyen, Christopher Poff, Morgusse, Tom Price, Cade Soiree, Esoteric Fictionalism, Austin Talman, Robin, Rachel Mixon, Duncan Skinner, Niels Abelgard, Tinfoil Pancakes, Kieran Gore, Aga Ghost, Barney Carroll, Joel, Daniel Hughes, Nelly Zacheva, J. Fraser Cartwright, Tamash Kispeter, and Paul Singleton. Once again, thank you all for watching, and I should have a final video up for the new year on my top books that I've read for the year, so sort of consolidation of that stuff. But otherwise, I will see you all in the new year. Things can only either stay the same, get worse, or get better, so let's hope it's at least one of those things. But otherwise, love you, bye!